Good morning. And for those who are faint with heat, I bring glad tidings. There is cold water and water bottles at the back. So on a serious note, if you do feel like you're getting a bit hot, we've got you covered. The next hygiene factor is turn over to Acts chapter 17, because we're going old school, which is we're reading the whole chapter 17 of the book of Acts. And I figure there's so much text there, it's going to be like a real mission to do the clicky thing. So put it on you. I know you all got phones. Take them out. Just turn over to Acts chapter 17. So the title of today's sermon is Stranger Ideas. And it's based on this idea that in Acts chapter 17, what we see is Paul has the unenviable task of communicating ideas that to the people he was sharing them with are just really, really strange. I don't know about you, if you've ever had this challenge to do that. I remember, this takes me back too many years, to be fair. When I was 19, I became a Christian. The beard gives away that was more than 1 or 2 years away. And I remember going for a hike with my new Christian friends and some of my old friends, and we went on the hike. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa, and we went for this walk up Table Mountain. Beautiful walk, lovely. We get to the top, and then my Christian friends had a sort of an appointment they needed to get to, so they took the cable car down. That's the quick route. And then I was going to walk down with my old friends. Basically, what this meant was my old friends now had me on my own. And they sat me down and basically said, like, what is going on with you, right? What is happening? And, we sort of took it from there. But there's this idea that basically you are now strange to us. What is happening? Well, let's pick it up in Acts chapter 17. Let's see how Paul dealt with this challenge. And in Acts 17, we see him going to 3 cities. And it starts off in Thessalonica. And these are cities which are in Greece. So let's pick it up in verse 1. One of the interesting things about getting older, by the way, is I had to print this in large print, effectively. And you'll see me holding it somewhere around here. Because otherwise, if I wear my reading glasses, I've got to flip them all the time. So just work with me here as I try to get this right. And in verse 1 it says, when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out of the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Now, the interesting thing here is certainly me, I've done this, see Christianity and Judaism as 2 different religions. But consider this. Paul was not teaching a new religion to the Jews. What he was doing was sharing the good news that their promised Messiah had come. Think about it. If you were a Jew back in the 1st century, you longing for the Messiah to come, wouldn't you want to know if he had come? Of course you would. When Paul self-identified, what's also interesting is he identified as a Jew. In Acts chapter 22, Paul is defending himself to this mob in Jerusalem where he's about to get beaten to death by them, and the Romans give him a chance to speak to them to defend himself. And what are his opening words? He says, "I am a Jew." He doesn't say, "I was a Jew, I used to be." He says, "I am a Jew, I'm one of you." The challenge, so where did things go pear-shaped? Well, the problem is that the profile of the Messiah that Paul was preaching about was just utterly different to what they were expecting. It was a really strange idea to them. And we see how Luke, the author of Acts, is describing it, right? He says, he, meaning Paul, reasoned with them from the scriptures. Okay, fine, so far so good. Explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. Say, what? Now let's have a moment of honesty, okay? So a little bit of self-reflection here. If someone came into our congregation and got up on the pulpit and they started teaching that Jesus is in fact a created being, like an angel. All right, fun fact, this is a heresy called Arianism. You can check it out, led to the Council of Nicaea, Nicene Creed. Interesting, fun fact, but let's move on. And they start teaching this, okay, and they are a really charismatic teacher, they're successful, they persuade a chunk of the congregation that they're right, but of course this doesn't go well, we're not good bedfellows, so they split off and form their own congregation. And they keep on pulling people over to them. How would you feel? How are you going to react? How are you going to respond? Are you going to be like, yeah, cool, that's just fine, it's a free world, free speech? Or are you going to have a problem with that? All right, let's be honest. And what I'd like us to just consider is this, that in Thessalonica, there's two stories going on. Right? So the first story sounds something like this. I share a message of great news that our Messiah has come. The kingdom of God is here. The Messiah did not overcome the Romans. He overcame the greatest enemy of all, death. You will be saved if you pledge allegiance to the Messiah and are baptized into the kingdom of God, which has come. This means that while there is good news, you can be saved, there's also less good news that right now you're not. And won't be unless you listen to my message. Read the fine print. That's story number one, okay? Story number two goes like this. I hear a dangerous message that paints the Messiah as a failure, killed by the ones he is supposed to conquer for us. And it's also deeply insulting, as it implies we are rejected by the God we have served faithfully in the tradition of our forefathers. And some members of our congregation have bought into this nonsense, and our congregation is in danger of tearing apart. And worse, you are spreading the idea that Jews think there is another king besides Caesar, and that's going to get us killed. This threat needs to be stopped now, by any and all means necessary. And there are many Bible heroes who used violence to do God's will. Think of Phineas, if you want to look him up. And so clearly God approves of violence when the cause is to defend his honor. Those stories are just a little bit different, all right? But you can see the power of the story. Everyone believes they are right. And we have to be honest about how we close down when we hear something that jars with us. I'm going to read a reflection by Think Love Education co-founder Jerry O'Gorman, who of course you don't know. But in full disclosure, I'm training as a Think Love Education coach, but that's a story for another day. This reflection is called Dismissing You. Yesterday, I dismissed what you were saying and replaced it with what I thought you were saying. I noticed that I can't hear what you're actually saying. I only hear what my mind is saying you're saying. I noticed I was in fear when this occurred. I noticed that I wasn't able to hear what you were actually saying until I calmed down. In an emergency, it's like there is an interpreter in my head translating what you are saying. And it is only grasping the essence of what you say. And then it abbreviates what you say and tries to give me the gist of what you're saying because it's an emergency. It doesn't have time for details. It tries to give me the bottom line, not the top line or lines in between. I notice the interpreter dismisses the details of what you are actually saying. It says it's an emergency. I notice the higher the emergency, the higher the fear. And the more I dismiss, the less I hear of what you're actually saying. It's like fear closes down my ear holes and only allows in a fraction of what you say. Fear impairs my ability to hear you. It's like the interpreter says, it's an emergency, we have a fire, do something now. So I grab the nearest fire extinguisher and start spraying. But because I dismissed the details, I'm using the combustible fire extinguisher instead of the grease fire extinguisher. And now I'm spraying and making the fire worse. Spraying and spreading the fire all over the place until it's an out-of-control, blazing inferno. I don't know if you relate to that. I know I certainly do. And as I read that, just line by line, I was like, oh my goodness me. You know, it's like someone, you know, you read something and you think like someone's got a window on my soul. And for me, I know this happens really for one of two reasons. One is because pride, you know, I think I know better. Or you just, it's obvious you don't know what you're talking about, clearly, you know. Or because I feel shut down by fear. I feel threatened in some way. And so I go into a defensive mode and then I just stop listening to what you're really saying. And in fairness, I know I'm not alone, all right? And the reason why is because this mob in Thessalonica, take a notice what they said, right? They said that Paul was, quote, defying Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, one called Jesus. True, but is it the whole truth? No, because the detail left out was that Jesus is not a political king. He's not in any way a political threat to the Roman order at all. And can we agree that's a rather important detail to leave out of that conversation? All right? Now, to be clear, I'm not defending or condoning mob violence, okay? What I am saying is that when we place ourselves in their shoes, we can understand their behavior without judgment. Because then we can realize that in different circumstances, there but for the grace of God go I. And there's, you know, this is one of those things where there's just so much that can be said. But like the mob, time is running me out of town, so we're going to need to move on to Berea. All right, so verse 10. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. So now they're in Berea, and the good news is this time the reaction is a lot more positive, right? Okay? It says they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Now, you know, let's be honest. If you on a missionary journey like Paul, this is the kind of reaction you want, right? This is really good. In fact, it goes on. It says, as a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. And what's really interesting here is that Paul gave the same message, right? It's not like he had a different message in Thessalonica. It's the same man, same message, and he's speaking to effectively the same audience, that is the Jewish diaspora spread across the Greco-Roman world. But the response, the reaction, is massively different. And what I'd like us to consider here, right, to reflect on, how people react is 100% on them, not you. Yeah. And conversely, how you respond is 100% on you and not them. Right? So to give attribution, this is also a principle that I've learned through Think Love Education. And let me unpack this idea a bit. Even if you are offensive to me, you're rude to me, through your language, your behavior, how you're communicating, I always have a choice how I'm going to respond. I can be gentle, I can be patient, I can be kind, I can step into your shoes, or I can be angry, I can be upset, I can be offended, I can be hostile, I can be defensive. Key thing is for me to understand is I have a choice how I'm going to respond. Like I suspect all of us, certainly true for me, many times in my life I've used language like, you are making me angry, you are frustrating me, you are irritating me, you're annoying me. Did you notice that what these statements have in common is that the blame, the cause of how I'm feeling is 100% on you? Is that actually true? It's not. It's not at all. How I feel, how I respond is 100% on me. I always have a choice. Now, again, moment of honesty. Is it easy to be Mr. or Mrs. Love when somebody is being hostile towards you? It's not. Okay, it's not. What I will say is this, is that it's a journey. For me, it's a journey. And what I am doing is that each time this happens and I find myself getting frustrated, my hope, my journey is to catch myself more and more quickly. So maybe it took me 5 minutes before I could go, you know what, let's start this conversation again. I'm sorry, I got really angry there. Now my hope is that next time this happens, and also I hope it doesn't happen too often, I should say, maybe I catch myself after 4 minutes, and then maybe after 3 minutes. And the point is, what I'm doing is I'm building new neural pathways. I'm learning to do what I call a manual override. So when I go into my automatic mode of how I'm feeling and how I'm responding, I'm training myself to remember how to act in a loving way and how to respond in a loving way. You know, this really matters because, you know, the first reason I would give why this really matters is I used to beat myself up about things that I had said or done. Ironically, not because of what I had said or done, but because of the wound that was left in me because of how they responded. All right? So their anger is what really left its mark on me. Even 20 years later. And, you know, when my coach shared this principle with me, I remember just feeling this enormous sense of relief. Like this huge burden had just been lifted off my shoulders because I realized, okay, I'm not innocent in the sense of whatever I did that prompted that anger, I can take, you know, I'm not saying that I'm not responsible for that, whatever that trigger was. But what I'm not responsible is for how you responded. That's on you. And the second reason why this really matters is that I'm empowered how I respond to others. I realize that whatever I think and feel, that is my choice. And I appreciate that much of the time my thoughts and feelings will be automatic, especially in confrontation. That for me is not a strength. When I end up in a confrontation, I can shut me down. But as I mentioned earlier, my hope is that I can train myself so that it's something I can become better and better in. Now, if you prefer to believe that it is, in fact, the other person who made you angry, irritated, frustrated, etc., then I invite you to consider something. The price of your innocence is impotence. All right? Now, this idea I learned from an executive coach called Fred Kaufman. You can find him on YouTube or LinkedIn Learning. The issue is this. If you are powerless, then there's nothing you can do, and there's nothing you can learn, and there's nothing you could do differently next time. It feels great to blame others. You know, Fred Kaufman puts it this way, it's like eating ice cream. It tastes great, but solves nothing. The truth is, it's much more satisfying to say it's all their fault than recognize our own role in what happened. And remember that even if the spark was 100% on them, how you react and how you respond is a role in the conflict. I came to the UK in 2004, and I remember, looking back, even then, there was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric in the media, in sectors of society. When I look back, I realized that I've allowed that message to seep into me. And one of the results of that is I didn't feel welcome. And when, and it happens, when there have been microaggressions, I didn't respond well. I either responded with an inane comment or just left, as soon as I could, just get away from there. And what I mean by microaggression would be like I'm having a great chat with somebody, you're from South Africa, it's lovely. And when they learn that I actually live here, it's interesting, you can just see a change. When they realize I'm not a tourist, in other words. You can just see a change in their demeanor. That's one example of what I'm talking about. And the temptation for me is to blame the media, is to blame those xenophobic elements of our society for how they have made me feel, for the way that it's impacted on me, for the way that I now respond to others. But I need to take my own medicine and put the ice cream back in the freezer. Because when I do that, what am I doing? I'm giving up my power, giving up my agency. Oh, it feels so good to be the victim. But then I make myself impotent. I make myself powerless. And when I recognize that they are responsible for their xenophobia and that it's 100% on them, I'm freed. I'm freed from buying into their story. I'm empowered to respond in love and with the power of love. And when I next receive a microaggression, and I'm fairly sure that at some point it will happen again, my hope, my prayer is that I will remain grounded in love and centered in love and respond from a place of love. And to be clear, that means calling it out, but doing so in a gentle way, in a loving way. So let's have a conversation about this. All right? Again, there is so much more that one could be said, but like Paul, again, we need to hurry off to Athens. All right. So, verse 16, for the next exciting episode in Stranger Ideas. No. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also women named Damaris and a number of others. So here in Athens, Paul had the challenge of teaching something completely and utterly strange to this Greek audience. And what is really noteworthy to me is that he started where the audience was, not where he was. You know, as we just spoke about earlier, he identified as a Jew. When he was in synagogues, he reasoned from the scriptures. So now he's in Athens, he's with Greco-Roman philosophers, and where does he start? He starts where they are. He introduced his subject using their own altar to an unknown God. And the idea of that was they had this big pantheon of gods, and they realized, well, what if there's a God we don't know, and this God is really ticked with us because we don't worship them? So they had this altar to an unknown God. It's like a sort of a, you know, we'd call it these days risk management, you know. But he starts there, right? Because that's where they were at. And then he quotes two Greco-Roman philosophers. He's not quoting the Jewish scriptures to them. He's quoting their own philosophers. But in all of this, he is upfront about his message. He says, God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So, you know, he doesn't shy away. He's not shy about the message of Jesus Christ. It's just that he starts where they are at. What's the lesson for us? When you talk with someone about something that you see from a very different perspective, are you willing to start where they are at? Now, I know that some of us have been to India, has even worked as missionaries in India. I've never been there. So you can tell me how true this is. But I was reading an article a little while ago, written by a Hindu person. And their perspective was that when Christian missionaries were going over to India, this would be back in the 1800s, early 1900s, they were incredibly dismissive of Hinduism. And they saw Christianity as superior, it's the right thing, it's the truth, you guys worship, you know, this children's stuff. What kind of impression do you think that leaves? All right, and the point of this person writing an article is that bad taste in the mouth, you could say bad taste in the mind, lives on to this day. Lives on to this day. It makes it very difficult for anybody trying to spread a Christian message to get that message across, because nobody likes being spoken to like that. You know, it's just to reflect for a moment. None of us likes a conversation in which that foundational premise is that they are right. Well, we're stupid. All right? Nobody likes that. Now I know, or at least I hope, I'd like to believe, that none of us would say someone is stupid for holding a set of beliefs, all right? But what does our non-verbal communication say? The tone of the voice, the little look in the eye, the way that we just want to talk about our proof facts and not theirs. What does that say? All right? And after Paul's discussion or debate at the Areopagus, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." And at that, Paul left the council. What we see is, once again, same man, same central message about Jesus Christ, and two very different responses. Some sneering, some saying, yeah, tell us some more. But what stands out to me here is that Paul didn't try to seal the deal. he didn't keep banging a drum to make them listen. It's interesting. The next sentence says, some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. But there's no indication in the text, at least that I can see, that suggests this is the same day. And why does that matter? You know, the reason why I mention this is because in our zeal to share the message of good news, okay, let me put my hand up. This was very true of my young self, young Martin. I could be overbearing. I could be overzealous. I could be, let's talk about what I want to talk about, less about what you want to talk about. All right? Very ineffective. Proverbs chapter 19 says, and this is the sort of older version of the NIV. I noticed they've changed some of the language, but zeal without knowledge is not good. Right? It's not good to be hasty and so miss the way. As a young man, I even memorized that proverb. It's funny because I think I always suspected it might apply to me, but wasn't really sure. Sort of 51-year-old Martin is like, let me help you out, buddy. You know, I always remember Andy Fleming saying he would have an argument with his 20-year younger self. I don't know about you. When he said that, I was like, I so relate. I so relate to that. You know, if I have one tip on this, I read this book called Tactics by a guy called Greg Kokel, which I really enjoyed. And in this book, it's about how to communicate the gospel message in an effective way. And the one tip that he gave that really struck with me, he called it, I think he called it like the Columbo question, for those old enough to remember the detective series Columbo. And the idea was that Columbo would go to the crime scene and he'd be like, fidgeting around doing his thing, and he's got this idea that, like, I think you know. But what he'll do is he'll, you know, just like, you know, and he's like this bumbling guy, right? He sort of bumbles around, but he's actually sharp as a razor. He just makes himself bumble around. And then what he'll do is on the way out, like he'll be like literally walking out the door on his way out, and then he'll say to the guy he suspects, he'll be, just one question. As though it's like a little throwaway, you know what I'm saying? Just like a little, just this one question. And the point of this, where am I going with Columbo here? Peter the Apostle says that we as Christians should always be willing, and hopefully that would mean able, to give a defense. That is to explain why we believe what we believe. All right. Hopefully, when I say defense, in a loving, gentle way, of course. But the point that I want to make is this: while that is true, we don't get a free pass. All right. If I'm going to teach strange ideas like this dead guy is actually alive, and they don't get a free pass either. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Right. I could be chatting with somebody, and certainly this has come up more than once in my life. Someone will say, look, I can't believe in that God of the Bible, that Christian God, because of all the pain and suffering in the world. Can we agree that there's a lot of pain and suffering in the world? Okay, so of course there is. But then what could one question look like in that kind of context? Be like, okay, absolutely. And we can talk about that, because I now need to be able to explain why I think that those ideas, that this all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God can allow such pain and suffering. That's on me. I need to be able to explain that. But my question to them would be, please help me to understand what your perfect world would look like. If you had all the power of God, what would the world look like if you created it? Because if you're saying you want a world in which there's no pain, let's just think for a moment what that world might look like. There'd be no triumph, no fulfillment, no victory, no feeling of, man, that was really tough. I had to dig deep, but we did it. Because, well, there's no pain, so how do you get to that? There's no pain receptors. I don't know when I've burnt my hand. There's no emotional pain to tell me, Martin, you really shouldn't have said that. What does that world look like? And then we can have that conversation. And what I'm getting at is, this is just a thought to share, that yes, we need to explain things from our side. We can't just say, oh no, just believe it. But they need to be able to do so as well. And something that I want to be very clear about is that the idea isn't to use this Colombo question as leverage, right? The idea isn't to say, well, you're wrong and I'm right. I would view it like this. It's like, I mean, there's so many analogies that you could use. I mean, it's a little bit like Hansel and Gretel laying some breadcrumbs for the way out the forest. That's what I'm doing, is I'm showing you the trail. What I'm trying to do is gently show you the exit. I'm trying to show that door there, that's where Jesus is. What I'm not going to do is grab you and drag you kicking and screaming. What I'm going to do is give you an invitation. I'm going to invite you to consider that there is a different way, and a righteous way. And whatever their response, in my gentle and generous spirit, I will have been a witness to the resurrection. Again, there's so much one could say about this. It was mentioned not that long ago in a sermon. This word martyr comes from the Greek martus, and it means to be a witness. So the idea was that our Christian brothers and sisters who were dying in the 1st, 2nd century, they were witnesses. Witnesses to what? To the resurrected Christ. Was their witness just that they were murdered? Well, if they were screaming profanity at their murderers, would that be much of a witness? I think we would say, well, not really. So what is the power of their witness? I can't help but think it wasn't just that they died, it was how they died. It was that they were able to go to their deaths in the arena with a gentle and quiet spirit that taught louder words than you could ever say from a pulpit. And if I could hope for just one thing, it's that the person I'm speaking with, that they would experience for that moment, in that conversation, the love of Christ, so that they could know what it looks like. And so in conclusion, we need to consider our actions when handling strange ideas. And perhaps we are the ones that are sharing strange ideas with others. And perhaps their ideas are strange to us. When this happens, I invite you to consider the 3 things that we've spoken about. The first is that there are 2 stories. Remember that. And if I want them to hear my story, I also need to listen to their story in the way that I would want them to listen to my story, which means without judgment, without expectation, placing myself in their shoes. And the second is how they respond is 100% on them, and how I respond is 100% on me. They are responsible for them, I am responsible for me. Which means that if they get all upset, that's on them. And no matter how they behave, I am called by Christ to act like Christ. And lastly, I don't have to win anything. In fact, there is nothing to win. The offer of a gentle invitation to consider a searching question is enough. And may my love in that moment be a witness to the love of Christ. Amen.